September 16, 1944, 0700 hours. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Bastogne, Belgium. The room was already arranged for certainty, not debate. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sat with his staff officers. A liaison from Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower was present to deliver a decision that had already been made somewhere else and was now being made real by signature and timing. The order was brief, formal, and absolute. Montgomery would temporarily assume command of the northern sector of the American forces. The stated reason was stabilization. The German Ardennes Offensive had shattered communication lines and severed the chain of control. Reports were arriving late or not at all. Units were being engaged without coordination. The front was beginning to look like disconnected fights rather than a single coherent defense. The transfer of authority was unprecedented in its scope. Montgomery was granted command of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies. It was not framed as consultation. It was not framed as a shared responsibility. It was framed as a temporary measure with full operational control, executed immediately, because the alternative was judged to be further collapse. There was no discussion in the room. No deliberation was invited. The language of the order allowed no space for negotiation, only compliance. Montgomery accepted the assignment without protest, understanding exactly what it meant. He was now responsible for armies that were not his own, in terrain he had not fully surveyed, against an enemy that had achieved complete surprise. The authority was temporary, but while it existed, it was complete. Within hours, his headquarters began receiving the first stream of American reports. Formations already engaged, some cut off, some retreating, some holding only because they had nowhere else to go. Supplies were low. Visibility was poor. Morale was fragile. The decision had been sold as operational necessity, but its risk was already visible. Montgomery's reputation, British prestige, and Allied cohesion were now tied to the performance of American armies under British command. Eisenhower's rationale, as presented, was purely functional, one decisive voice in the northern sector to restore order. Montgomery's acceptance was equally pragmatic. Authority had been given, responsibility assumed, and the narrative of control had already been set before the first counterstroke was even conceivable. The military opportunity in December 1944 existed because the German offensive was structurally fragile from the moment it began. Surprise had been achieved, but sustainability had not. The German plan depended on compressed timing, uninterrupted movement, and fuel capture along the way. None of those conditions were guaranteed once the initial penetration was made. The German advance drove through a narrow corridor carved into the Ardennes forest. Roads were few. Movement was linear. Armored columns were forced into predictable routes where deviation was impossible without abandoning vehicles. Every kilometer gained increased exposure. Supply convoys lagged behind advancing spearheads, vulnerable to disruption and increasingly unable to keep pace. Fuel consumption exceeded planning estimates almost immediately, turning momentum into liability. From an operational standpoint, the German flanks were thin by design. Forces were concentrated forward, leaving minimal strength to secure the shoulders of the Bulge. This created a classic overextension scenario. The deeper the penetration, the weaker the perimeter became. A coordinated Allied response did not require immediate counterattack everywhere. It required time, containment, and selective pressure against points where German units could not maneuver or resupply. American formations, despite being surprised, were not destroyed. Many units retained cohesion even while displaced. Artillery remained intact. Command structures were disrupted but recoverable. Defensive positions formed naturally around road junctions and towns that the Germans could not bypass without slowing their advance. Each delay compounded German fuel consumption and mechanical attrition. Bastogne exemplified this opportunity. It sat astride critical road networks feeding the German corridor. Its value was not symbolic. It was logistical. As long as it remained contested, German movement remained constrained. Other strong points along the advance functioned similarly, forcing the Germans to either commit forces to reduction or push forward without securing their rear. Both choices weakened the offensive. Weather initially protected the German advance by grounding Allied air power. That advantage was temporary and known to be temporary. Once skies cleared, Allied aircraft would regain the ability to interdict roads, destroy supply columns, and isolate forward units. German planners had accepted this risk. Operational logic dictated that if the offensive did not achieve decisive results quickly, it would unravel rapidly once air superiority returned to the Allies. The terrain amplified every German weakness. Dense forests limited observation and command control. Narrow roads prevented dispersion. Mechanical breakdowns accumulated as vehicles idled in traffic or were forced off prepared surfaces. Recovery was often impossible. Disabled vehicles became obstacles, further slowing movement and increasing vulnerability to artillery and air attack. Allied reserves were not static. Mobile formations existed outside the immediate penetration zone. Once the axis of advance was identified, these forces could maneuver to threaten flanks and rear areas. Speed was not required initially. Positioning was. The German advance created its own map of vulnerability simply by moving forward. Operationally, the German offensive relied on American psychological collapse that did not occur. Units fell back, but they did not disintegrate. Commanders improvised. Defensive lines bent without breaking completely. Each hour of resistance bought time, and time was the decisive factor the Germans could not afford. The opportunity, therefore, was not to crush the offensive immediately, but to let it exhaust itself under controlled pressure. Containment, denial of objectives, protection of key nodes, and preparation for counterattack were sufficient. The German plan had no second phase that accounted for prolonged resistance or restored logistics. Once momentum slowed, the offensive would consume itself. From a purely military perspective, the Ardennes Offensive was vulnerable because it attempted to trade strategic reality for operational gamble. The Allies did not need brilliance to defeat it. They needed coherence, patience, and the ability to prevent collapse while the enemy overreached. The opportunity lay in recognizing that the German advance carried the seeds of its own failure from the moment it passed beyond its supply capacity. By the time Montgomery formally assumed responsibility for the northern sector, his assessment was already formed. He did not arrive improvising. He arrived having reduced the chaos to categories that could be managed. His first concern was not counterattack. It was coherence. He ordered an immediate consolidation of command reporting. Fragmented American formations were not to be redirected blindly forward. They were to be identified, anchored, and reconnected to a functioning hierarchy. Units that could still fight were assigned defensible ground rather than exposed maneuver. Units that could not were withdrawn deliberately instead of collapsing piecemeal. This was not retreat. It was controlled contraction designed to deny the Germans momentum without sacrificing cohesion. Montgomery focused on geography rather than enemy strength. He identified road junctions, river crossings, and towns that governed movement rather than terrain that invited engagement. Bastogne was treated as a logistical pivot, not a heroic stand. The Meuse crossings were prioritized as non-negotiable anchors. Everything else was judged by whether it supported those objectives or distracted from them. His preparation reflected an expectation of delay rather than breakthrough. He assumed the Germans would advance farther before they stopped. That assumption shaped his posture. Defensive depth was built behind the front line. Artillery was massed where it could dominate roads rather than chase targets. Reserves were held back, not parceled out, because he anticipated that German exhaustion would arrive unevenly and without warning. Intelligence was treated as a pattern, not a prediction. Frontline reports were inconsistent, but when layered with aerial reconnaissance and intercepted communications, they revealed a familiar structure: armored thrusts outrunning their support, fuel shortages emerging early, and command friction inside German units forced to operate in forested terrain. Montgomery did not need precise enemy locations. He needed confirmation that the German plan was behaving as expected. He reorganized liaison channels between British and American staffs to shorten decision cycles. Orders were simplified. Objectives were limited. He avoided complex maneuvers that required perfect coordination because he assumed communications would remain unreliable. Planning was built around what could be controlled, not what was theoretically optimal. Logistics were addressed early. Montgomery had learned in previous campaigns that collapse often began with supply confusion rather than enemy action. He ensured that ammunition and fuel distribution within his sector was centralized and protected. Movement priorities were imposed. Non-essential traffic was restricted. The goal was not abundance, but predictability. Air support planning was deferred rather than forced. Weather made immediate coordination impractical, but he prepared target priorities for the moment skies cleared. Roads, bridges, and choke points were identified in advance so that air power could be applied immediately once conditions allowed. This was not optimism. It was sequencing. Montgomery's credibility rested on consistency rather than innovation. His record showed a preference for preparation over risk and containment over exploitation. In the Ardennes, that instinct aligned with circumstance. The situation did not reward speed. It punished disorganization. His planning accepted that the German offensive could not be reversed instantly, only absorbed until it lost coherence. He anticipated criticism. He knew that American commanders would resist British direction and that political pressure would surround every visible decision. That awareness did not alter his operational approach. It narrowed it. He avoided actions that could fail publicly even if they offered theoretical advantage. Stability was the objective because instability carried political as well as military cost. What Montgomery prepared was not a decisive stroke, but a framework within which others could act. His arrangements assumed that American forces would bear the brunt of combat, that German momentum would decay, and that opportunity would emerge unevenly across the front. His task, as he defined it, was to ensure that when that moment arrived, the northern sector would still exist as an organized force capable of exploiting it. This preparation did not promise victory. It promised survival long enough for German assumptions to collapse under their own weight. In that sense, Montgomery's warning was implicit in his actions. He prepared not for what he hoped would happen, but for what he believed was inevitable, that the offensive would outrun itself, and that the side which remained coherent longest would determine the outcome. The moment Montgomery assumed command, military logic no longer operated in isolation. Every operational choice was immediately filtered through political consequence, alliance management, and institutional fear. The authority granted to him was real, but it existed inside a structure that could not tolerate visible failure or public friction. Eisenhower's decision to place Montgomery over American armies was framed as emergency necessity, but it was also a political calculation. The northern sector had fractured. Bradley's headquarters was cut off. American command cohesion was compromised. Eisenhower needed a functioning command immediately, not after consultation or negotiation. Montgomery was available, senior, and already positioned. That made him useful. It did not make him uncontroversial. American commanders understood what the decision implied. It placed U.S. forces under foreign command on American soil of responsibility at the most dangerous moment of the campaign. Bradley objected. Others followed. Their concern was not purely professional. It was institutional. The transfer threatened American command prestige and risked domestic political backlash. Eisenhower absorbed the resistance and overruled it because the alternative was paralysis. Montgomery accepted the command knowing that his margin for error was narrower than anyone else's. A British commander stabilizing American armies could be tolerated. A British commander failing publicly could not. This reality shaped his actions as decisively as any German movement. Risk that might be acceptable for an American general was unacceptable for him. Every decision carried diplomatic weight. British political backing insulated Montgomery, but also constrained Eisenhower. Churchill viewed Montgomery not simply as a field marshal, but as a symbol of British relevance in the Allied coalition. Removing or sidelining him during a crisis would have triggered immediate intervention from London. Eisenhower was aware of this. His authority as supreme commander was formal, but coalition reality limited how directly he could confront British interests without destabilizing the alliance. This dynamic altered command behavior. Montgomery could not be treated as a subordinate in the usual sense. Eisenhower could not issue directives that appeared corrective or disciplinary. Communication was managed carefully. Disagreements were softened. Criticism was delayed or redirected. Military efficiency yielded to alliance preservation. Institutional memory compounded the problem. Montgomery's conduct earlier in the campaign had already strained relations. He had secured priority for resources, dismissed dissenting intelligence, and shaped public narratives aggressively. Operation Market Garden was still unresolved in reputational terms. Confronting him again, during a German offensive that threatened morale, risked exposing fractures the enemy could exploit politically even if not militarily. As a result, military logic was narrowed. Options that might have involved aggressive redistribution of forces, public reassignment of commanders, or rapid shifts in operational emphasis were avoided because they would highlight the unusual command arrangement. Stability became the overriding requirement, not optimization. American forces under Montgomery were expected to perform without appearing subordinated. British forces were expected to support without appearing dominant. This required deliberate ambiguity. Orders were phrased carefully. Credit was managed quietly at first. Responsibility was centralized operationally but diffused rhetorically. Montgomery himself contributed to the tension. His command style was centralized, deliberate, and unapologetic. He did not conceal his belief that order required control. This reassured British leadership but unsettled American commanders accustomed to greater autonomy. Eisenhower tolerated the friction because cohesion mattered more than comfort. The combined chiefs framework further constrained action. Strategic shifts required consensus across national lines. Even temporary operational decisions were evaluated for their political ripple effects. Every significant move carried implications for post-war positioning, national prestige, and public perception. The battlefield was no longer the sole arena of consequence. In this environment, the German offensive became only one of several threats being managed. The others were diplomatic rupture, public recrimination, and alliance credibility. Military logic suggested exploitation of German overextension wherever it appeared. Political logic demanded restraint, coordination, and above all, the appearance of unity. The overrule was not a single moment. It was a continuous pressure that shaped what could be attempted and what could not. Montgomery was given authority, but not freedom. Eisenhower retained responsibility, but not complete control. American commanders fought, but under a structure they resented. British leadership supported, but watched closely. What emerged was a command system optimized not for speed or boldness, but for survivability under scrutiny. The Ardennes campaign in the north was conducted inside a political containment zone. Decisions were filtered, risks moderated, and narratives managed in parallel with troop movements. The result was not paralysis, but constraint. Military logic operated, but within boundaries set by alliance fear rather than battlefield opportunity. The offensive would be defeated, but not in a way that clarified authority or resolved underlying tensions. The system held because it had to. It functioned not because it was efficient, but because failure was politically intolerable. In the Ardennes, command was not overruled by incompetence or cowardice. It was overruled by the reality that the war could not be won if the alliance fractured, even if that meant accepting military compromises that prolonged the fight. The consequences of the decision unfolded immediately, not as a single dramatic reversal, but as a chain reaction set in motion by containment rather than collapse. The northern sector did not break. That alone altered the trajectory of the German offensive. American units that had been dislocated were not destroyed. They were absorbed into a defensive framework that emphasized holding ground long enough for the German advance to lose coherence. Roads remained contested. River crossings were denied. Towns that controlled movement became fixed points the Germans could not bypass without consequence. The advance slowed not because it was stopped outright, but because it was forced to negotiate resistance at every critical junction. German momentum began to decay visibly. Fuel shortages that had been theoretical in planning became operational facts. Armored columns stalled on forest roads with empty tanks. Recovery vehicles could not reach them. Disabled vehicles were pushed aside or abandoned, narrowing routes further and creating bottlenecks that compounded delay. Units at the tip of the advance found themselves waiting for supplies that did not arrive. Bastogne emerged as a central node in this process, not as a symbol, but as an obstruction. German forces surrounded it, but could not neutralize it quickly. Every hour spent containing Bastogne was an hour not spent advancing west. The roads feeding the corridor remained contested. German planners had assumed rapid reduction or bypass. Neither occurred. The offensive timetable began to slip irreversibly. Weather, which had initially shielded the German advance, began to change. As skies cleared, Allied air power returned with immediate effect. Supply convoys moving along predictable routes were exposed. Fuel trucks became high-value targets. Bridges and road junctions were attacked repeatedly. German units, already operating at the edge of logistical viability, were pushed beyond it. Montgomery's command structure in the north absorbed pressure without seeking decisive engagement. This frustrated German expectations. They had planned for American disintegration, not managed resistance. Defensive depth forced German units to fight repeatedly for limited gains, consuming fuel and ammunition at a rate that could not be sustained. The German advance became uneven. Some spearheads moved forward briefly, others halted completely. Coordination suffered. Commanders lost contact with subordinate units. Forest terrain magnified confusion. Without air reconnaissance, German situational awareness deteriorated rapidly. What had been a concentrated thrust fragmented into isolated struggles. Meanwhile, Allied reserves outside the Bulge repositioned deliberately. Patton's Third Army executed a rapid redeployment from the south, not because the northern sector had collapsed, but because it had not. Containment bought time. Time allowed maneuver. When Patton struck northward, he did so against a German flank already strained by supply failure and operational exhaustion. The relief of Bastogne marked a turning point not because it was dramatic, but because it confirmed that the German corridor could not be sustained. Once the encirclement failed, the logic of the offensive collapsed. German units now faced pressure from multiple directions while still lacking fuel and replacements. Losses mounted. Tanks abandoned due to fuel shortages were destroyed or captured. Elite formations that had been husbanded for the offensive were depleted beyond recovery. Infantry units suffered attrition without achieving objectives that justified the cost. The offensive ceased to be an advance and became a withdrawal under pressure. Montgomery's sector did not deliver a decisive blow. It did not encircle the German army. It did not produce a spectacular victory. What it did was deny the Germans the operational freedom they required to exploit their initial success. The offensive was forced into a prolonged engagement it was never designed to survive. The strategic consequences extended beyond the Ardennes. The German army expended its last significant reserves in the west. Fuel stocks were exhausted. Equipment losses could not be replaced. Units withdrawn from the Bulge were shadows of their former strength. The ability to mount a coherent defense along the Rhine was compromised permanently. Allied forces emerged from the battle with their command structures intact and their logistical superiority reaffirmed. The temporary shock of surprise gave way to systemic advantage. Once the German offensive failed, there was no mechanism to restore initiative. Subsequent Allied advances encountered resistance, but not strategic coherence. Politically, the consequences were more complex. Montgomery's role in stabilizing the North was real, but his public handling of the outcome strained alliance relations. His press statements implied a degree of ownership that American commanders rejected. This did not alter the military outcome, but it deepened institutional resentment that had been contained during the crisis. Eisenhower tolerated the friction because the immediate danger had passed. The alliance had survived the shock intact. That, more than any tactical success, was the decisive outcome. The German attempt to fracture Allied unity through operational surprise had failed. The Ardennes Offensive ended not with encirclement or annihilation, but with exhaustion. German forces withdrew, having achieved none of their strategic objectives. They had not reached the Meuse. They had not split the Allied front. They had not forced a political settlement. What they had done was accelerate their own collapse. Every consequence traced back to the initial decision to contain rather than gamble. By prioritizing coherence over boldness, the Allies allowed German assumptions to fail on their own terms. The price was high in casualties and disruption, but the outcome was decisive. The northern sector held. The Bulge was reduced. The German army emerged weakened beyond recovery. The road into Germany remained open not because it was seized in the Ardennes, but because the German attempt to block it there consumed the last resources capable of doing so. The decision to transfer command did not win the battle. It prevented disaster. That distinction defined the consequences. The Ardennes did not end with triumph. It ended with inevitability restored. The German army had gambled on surprise. The Allies responded with endurance. The result was not dramatic, but it was final. The post-war record clarified what the crisis obscured. With distance, documents replaced impressions, and outcomes were separated from personalities. The decision to transfer command, once framed as an emergency improvisation, emerged as a calculated act shaped as much by alliance necessity as by military requirement. Eisenhower's papers show a consistent pattern. His priority during the Ardennes was not tactical brilliance, but continuity. He feared that fragmented command would invite not only operational failure, but political rupture. The temporary elevation of Montgomery was intended to impose order quickly, even at the cost of resentment. In post-war correspondence, Eisenhower acknowledged the damage done to American pride, but judged it acceptable compared to the risk of visible disunity under German pressure. Montgomery's own memoirs reinforced this divergence. He portrayed the episode as validation of his methodical approach, emphasizing stabilization and control. What his account omitted was how narrow his freedom of action had been. Declassified communications reveal that major strategic decisions remained constrained by coalition consensus and that Eisenhower retained oversight far more actively than public narratives suggested at the time. German records offered the most decisive confirmation. Unit logs, fuel inventories, and post-war interrogations showed that the Ardennes Offensive was collapsing under its own assumptions well before Allied counterattacks reached full momentum. Panzer divisions reported immobilization due to fuel shortages within days. Supply officers documented convoys destroyed or delayed beyond recovery. Commanders admitted that once surprise failed to deliver immediate results, there was no operational contingency. Captured German officers consistently emphasized the same point. The offensive depended on American collapse that never occurred. Resistance, even when disorganized, was sufficient to disrupt timing. Every delay magnified logistical failure. By the time Allied air power returned, the offensive was already unsustainable. These assessments did not credit any single Allied commander with decisive brilliance. They described a system breaking against reality. American after-action reports echoed this conclusion. Units that had been surprised but not destroyed regained cohesion rapidly once command lines stabilized. Artillery effectiveness, logistical depth, and industrial replacement capacity overwhelmed German losses. The relief of Bastogne, often remembered as a dramatic moment, appeared in records as an inevitable consequence of German overextension rather than a narrow escape. The institutional lesson recorded internally was not about heroism or error, but about structure. The Allied command system, though strained, proved resilient. Authority could be redistributed temporarily without collapse. Political friction could be suppressed long enough to allow military processes to function. That resilience contrasted sharply with the German command structure, which lacked both flexibility and material depth. Montgomery's controversial press conference became a footnote in these records, not because it was insignificant, but because it did not alter outcomes. Internal memoranda from American commanders expressed anger, but also relief that the immediate crisis had passed. The alliance absorbed the insult because the war was nearly won and because German defeat in the West was now only a matter of time. Historians reviewing the campaign after the release of classified material converged on a shared assessment. The Ardennes was not lost by German tactical incompetence alone, nor won by Allied genius. It was decided by logistics, coalition endurance, and the failure of a gamble that required perfection in an environment that punished delay. The temporary command transfer, when stripped of emotion and reputation, functioned as intended. It imposed coherence during a period of maximum stress. It did not accelerate victory. It did not shorten the war. It prevented fragmentation at a moment when fragmentation would have been catastrophic politically even if recoverable militarily. In hindsight, the Ardennes confirmed that by late 1944, Germany no longer possessed the capacity to recover from strategic overreach. The offensive consumed what remained of its mobile strength. After it failed, the Western Front became a question of tempo rather than survival. Allied advances that followed faced resistance, but not the possibility of reversal. The post-war record closed the case decisively. The Ardennes was not a turning point in the sense of altered destiny. It was a test of systems under strain. The Allied system bent and held. The German system broke. The decision at Bastogne mattered because it preserved structure long enough for inevitability to assert itself. The Ardennes offensive ended as a closed case because its outcome was determined long before the last German units withdrew. The decision to transfer command did not alter the strategic balance. It preserved a structure long enough for that balance to assert itself. Montgomery's temporary authority over American armies neither won nor lost the battle. It imposed order at a moment when disorder threatened to become political rupture. That was its function. It succeeded because it limited collapse, not because it enabled brilliance. The German offensive failed because it was built on assumptions that could not survive resistance, weather, and logistics acting together. The German plan required speed, fuel, and psychological shock. It achieved only the first, and only briefly. Once momentum slowed, there was no recovery mechanism. Supply failed. Coordination degraded. Air power returned. The offensive consumed its own strength and left nothing behind to defend what remained. Allied command, though strained by ego and alliance friction, proved resilient. Authority was redistributed without disintegration. Resentment was contained. Operational coherence was restored quickly enough to deny the Germans decisive results. The system held because it was designed to absorb shock, not because its leaders were flawless. Montgomery emerged neither vindicated nor discredited by the record. His actions stabilized a sector. His constraints prevented excess. His personality complicated alliance relations without altering outcomes. Eisenhower's compromise preserved unity at the cost of personal and institutional tension. That trade was accepted because the alternative carried greater risk. The battle did not hinge on a single maneuver, commander, or decision beyond the initial gamble made by Germany. Once that gamble failed, the conclusion was inevitable. The Ardennes accelerated German collapse by exhausting the last reserves capable of offensive action in the West. There was no redemption in the outcome. There was no triumph in the method. The offensive ended because structure defeated impulse, logistics defeated ambition, and endurance outlasted surprise. The record is closed. If you want to examine how similar command decisions shaped the final race into Germany, subscribe for further case files and leave a comment to indicate which decision should be opened next.